which could the last years of Suleiman, his military glory and imperial ambition, sustained in the year 1565, the year before his death. The heaviest blow and most humiliating disappointment that had befallen them since the memorable retreat from Vienna. The second check was caused by the complete failure of the expedition against Malta, which was led by the admirals Mustafa and Piale, and nobly and victoriously encountered by Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, under their heroic Grand Master La Valletta. After the knights had been driven from Rhodos on Suleiman's conquest of that island in the beginning of his reign, they had established their order at Malta, which together with the neighboring island of Goza was given to them by the Emperor Charles V, who compassionated their misfortunes, admired their valor, and appreciated the importance of the services which they rendered to Christendom as a barrier against the advancing power of the Ottomans. When the knights took possession of Malta, it was little more than a shelterless rock, but they discerned the natural advantages of the place, and immediately commenced fortifying the remarkable system of harbours of the southeastern side of the island, where the city of Malta now reared its grim ranges of batteries and bastions beneath the British flag. The squadrons of knights issuing from the Maltese havens cooperated actively with the fleets of Spain and of every foe of the Crescent, and incessant warfare was carried on under the Maltese cross against the Turks, in which deeds of the chivalrous enterprise were often performed, but in which a piratical love of plunder and a brutal spirit of cruelty too often disgraced the Christian as well as the Mohammedan belligerents. The attention of Suleiman was soon fixed on Malta as the new nest of the revived hornets who intercepted the commerce and assailed the coast of his empire, and at last the capture by 5 Maltese galleys of rich Turkish galleons, belonging partly to some of the ladies of the Seraglio, exasperated the Sultan, who regarded it as an insult to his household. He was further urged to an attack upon the order by the Mufti, who represented to him how sacred a duty it was to rescue the numerous Moslem slaves who were held in cruel bondage by the knights. Nor can we suppose him to have been indifferent to the military and political importance of the possession of Malta. If the Ottoman arms had once been securely established in that island, it would have served as a basis of operations against Sicily and South Italy, which hardly could have failed a success. Accordingly, a mighty armament was prepared in the port of Constantinople during the winter of 1564. The troops amounted to upwards of 30,000, including 4,500 Janissaries, and the fleet comprised 181 vessels. The fifth vizier Mustafa Pasha was appointed Seraskier, or commander-in-chief of the expedition, and under him was the renowned Piyade, the hero of Jerbe. The equally celebrated Dragut was to join them at Malta with the naval and military forces of Tripoli, and all the stores and munitions of war that the skilful engineers and well-stocked arsenals of Constantinople could supply were shipped in liberal provision for a difficult siege and long campaign. The fleet sailed from the Golden Horn on the last 1st of April 1565. The Grand Vizier Ali accompanied the Seraskier and Captain Pasha to the place of embarkation, and it was long remembered that at parting he said laughingly, "There go two brisk companions of an exquisite relish for coffee and opium, on a voyage of pleasure among the islands. Their fleet must be all laden with the Arabian bean and essence of henbane." Van Hammer recounts his pleasantry not for its humour, but on account of the characteristic comments made on it by the principal Ottoman historians. They blame it as unworthy of the Grand Vizier's dignity, and say that such levity from such a personage was a bad omen at the commencement of a serious and important enterprise. The remarks which they add that the Grand Vizier was on bad terms with the two officers at whom he thus jested, and that the Seraskier and Admiral were unfriendly towards each other and both jealous of Dragut, with whom they were to cooperate, show better causes for the failure of the expedition than the ultimate jest which they gravely criticize. The knights knew well what a storm was about to break up on Malta, and they exerted themselves to the utmost to improve the defences of their island zone. The old city, as it then existed, occupied the centre of the three spits of land which project into the great harbour on the eastern side. The innermost of these projecting peninsulas, called Isle de la Sangle, was also occupied and fortified. Mount Scaberras, the ridge of island which runs out to the open sea, diving the great eastern harbour from the western harbour, called Port Musset, and on which the modern city of La Valletta stands, was not at this time built upon, except at the extremity where an important castle, called the Fort of the St. Elmo, had been raised to command the entrances of both harbours. On a muster of the forces of the defenders of Malta, they were found to consist of 700 knights, besides serving brothers, and about 8,500 soldiers, comprising the crews of the galleys, hired troops, and the militia of Ireland. Spain sent a small auxiliary force, and promised her viceroy of Scilly, should bring ample succor. The Pope gave a sum of 10,000 crowns, but from no other Christian power did the knights receive aid. Their means of safety consisted in their strong and well-armed walls, their own skill and courage, and above all the genius of heroism of their Grand Master, John de la Valette, who had been elected providentially for Malta about 7 years before its memorable siege. When the approach of the Ottoman armament was announced, La Valletta assembled his knights and addressed him, "A formidable enemy is coming like the thunderstorm upon us, and if the banner of the cross must sink before the misbelievers, let us see in this a signal that heaven demands from us those lives which we have solemnly devoted to its service. He who dies in this cause dies a happy deed, and to render ourselves worthy to meet it. Let us renew at the altar those vows, which ought to make us not only fearless, but invincible in the fight." The brotherhood devoutly obeyed their master's exhortation. They renewed the vows of their religious knighthood, and after the solemn ceremonial, and after partaking together of the whole sacrament, they swore to give up all fights among themselves, to renounce all temporal objects and pleasures until their deliverance should be effected, and to stand between the cross and profanation to the last drop of their blood. The Ottoman fleet appeared off Malta on the 19th May 1565. Piale wished to wait for the arrival of Dragut before they commenced operations, but the Seraskier on the next day disembarked the troops and began the attack upon St. Elmo. The rocky nature of the ground on Mount Sceberras made it impossible for the Turkish engineers to work trenches, and as substitutes they pushed forward removable breastworks of timber, which were thickly coated on the outside with clay and rushes kneaded together. 5 days after the commencement of the siege, the Turkish sea captain Uluç Ali, called by the Christians Oşiyalı, who was destined to acquire such celebrity in the next reign, arrived with 6 galleys from Alexandria, and at last on the 2nd June Dragut appeared with the squadron of Tripoli. The old admiral disapproved of the attack on St. Elmo, saying that the fort must have fallen of itself when the city was taken, but he declared that as the operation had been commenced, it ought to be persevered with. Fresh batteries were placed by his directions against the fort, and in particular he established one on the opposite or western side of Port Muscat, on the cape that still bears his name. The Turkish ships plied the seaward defences of the fort with their artillery. On the land side, 36 heavy guns battered in the in breach, and the bolts of Dragut's battery from the across Port Musset swept the ravine with a breaking fire. The little garrison did their duty nobly, and aided by occasional reinforcements from the main body of their comrades, who held the Bourg and the Isle de la Sangle. They repulsed repeated attempts made by the Turks to escalade their walls, and they impeded the advance of the enemy's works by bold and frequent sorties. The viceroy of Sicily had promised La Valletta to send a relieving force to the island by the middle of June, and every day that the defense of St. Elmo could be prolonged was considered by the knights to be of vital importance for the safety of the island. When some of the knights posted in the fort represented to La Valletta the ruined state of its defenses and the rapidly increasing destructiveness of the Ottoman fire, he told them that they must die in discharge of their duty, and the noble band of martyrs remained in St. Elmo to die accordingly. Dragut ordered a general assault on the fort on the 16th of June. The landward walls had now been shattered and rent, and the Turkish stormers advanced without difficulty through the yawning breaches, but behind this the knights arrived in steady phalanx, and armed with long pikes, from a living wall against which the bravest Turks rushed with their scimitars in vain. Meanwhile, the Christian cannon from St. Angelo and St. Michael, the forts at the extremities of the Bourg, and the Isle de la Sangle played with terrible effect on the flanks of the huge columns of the assailants. After 6 hours' conflict, the Ottomans retreated, leaving the 2,000 of their comrades slain. Dragut himself received his death wound during the assault. A cannonball from the castle of St. Angelo splintered a rock near which he was standing, and the fragments of stone struck the old seaman's head. The Seraskier, with whom he had been conversing respecting the construction of a new battery to reply to St. Angelo, ordered a clock to be flung over the corpse, and remained calmly on the spot while he completed the requisite instructions to the engineers. 7 days afterwards, the death of Dragut was avenged by the fall of St. Elmo, after a furious and long-continued assault in which every man of the defenders was slain in violent fight. In the siege of this outwork, 300 knights and 1,300 soldiers of the order and 8,000 of the Turks perished. Mustafa Pasha, when he looked from the ruins of this small castle across to the massive towers of the Bourg, which was now to be attacked, could not help exclaiming, "If the child has cost us so much, what shall we have to pay for the father?" He sent a Christian slave to summon the Grand Master to surrender. La Valletta led the messenger round the lofty ramparts and pointing down to the deep ditches beneath them. He said, "Tell the Saraskier that this is the only land I can give him. Let him and his emissaries come and take possession." Mustafa commenced the attack with ardor, and both the Borg and the Isle de la Sangre were closely invested and cannonaded from the mainland, while also a row of formidable Turkish batteries thundered on them from the St. Elmo and Mont Scabrius. This great siege was prolonged until the 11th of September by the obstinate vehemence of the besiegers and the truly chivalrous gallantry of the besieged. During the continuance of the operations, the Turks were reinforced by a flotilla from Algiers commanded by the Beyler Bey Hassan, the son of the great Barbarossa and son-in-law of Dragut. Hassan demanded leave to sustain the honor of this illustrious names by leading an assault upon the Isle de la Sangre. The Saraskier places 5,000 men at his disposal, and with this Hassan attacked the works from the mainland, while Candeliza, a Greek renegade who had grown grey in piracy and war, led the Algerine galleys on an attack on the inner part of the harbor. Hassan brought back only 500 men out of his 5,000. Nor was Candeliza more successful. No less than 10 general assaults were made and repulsed before the siege was raised, and innumerable minor engagements took place, in which each side showed such valor as to air its enemy's prize, and each side also unhappily too often stained its glory by the exhibition of ferocious cruelty. In one of these encounters the Saraskier had sent a band of able swimmers across part of the harbor with access to destroy a stockade which the knights had erected. La Valletta opposed this assailants by calling for volunteer swimmers from among the Maltese. The islanders came forward readily for this service, and stripping themselves naked and armed only with short swords, and bent of them swam to the stockade, and after a short but desperate struggle in the water, they completely routed the Turkish hatchetmen and saved the works. The long repetition of defeat and bodiless range of degrees wore out the energies of the Turks, and at last, at the beginning of September, the news arrives that the long-expected fleet of the Sicilian viceroy was on the sea. The succors of thus tardily sent to La Valletta and his brave comrades amounted to less than 8,000 men, but rumor magnified their numbers, and the weary and dispirited besiegers on the 11th of September abandoned their heavy ordnance, and left the island which had been crimsoned with so much slaughter and had been made the theatre of such unrivalled heroism. This memorable siege is said to have cost the lives of 25 Turks and 5,000 of brave defenders. So reduced indeed was the garrison at the time of its rescue, that when they marched out to take possession of the guns which the Turk had abandoned, La Valletta could only muster 600 men fit for service. At the time when the tidings that the siege of Malta was raised reached Constantinople, Suleiman was preparing for a new struggle with Austria. The disputes between the rival parties in Hungary had again brought on hostilities. Maximilian II, who had succeeded Ferdinand, had in person attacked and captured Tokai and Serenches, and the Turkish Pasha, Mustafa Sokoli, had invaded Croatia. Soliman determined to conduct the campaign against the young German emperor in person, and there can be little doubt that this Austrian war saved the Knights of Malta from a renewed attack in 1566, which must, in all human probability, have been fatal. Soliman was now 76 years old, and though enfeebled by age and illness, that he was no longer able to sit on horseback, but was borne in a litter at the head of his army, which commenced his march from Constantinople to Hungary on the 1st of May 1566. Before he left his capital for the last time, Soliman had the satisfaction of seeing the great aqueducts completed which had been built by his orders for the supply of the city. The Sultan arrived at Semlin in Hungary the 27th of June and received the solemn homage of young Sigismund Zapolia, the titular king of Hungary and Transylvania, under Ottoman protection. Suleiman especially desired to capture in this campaign the two strong places of Erlau and Sziget, which had on former occasions baffled the attack of the Turks. A bold exploit of Count Cini, the governor of Sziget, who surprised and cut off a detachment of Bosnian troops. While on their march to reinforce the Sultan's army, determined Soliman to make Sziget the first object of his arms, and on the 5th of August Ottoman forces encamped round that city. It was destined to be the death place both of the Turkish sovereign and the Christian chief. Cini himself burned the lower or new town, an indefensible but great reliance was placed on the strength of the citadel, which was protected by a deep fen that lay between it and the old or upper town. The Turks carried the town in 5 days, though not without severe fighting and heavy loss, and Cini and his garrison of 3,200 men then retired to the citadel, where they hoisted the black flag and took an oath never to surrender but to fight to the last man and the last gasp. The Turkish engineers formed causeways across the marsh, and they established breastworks near the walls where the Janissaries were posted, who kept down the fire of the artillery of the besieged by an incessant discharge of musketry upon the embrasures, and at every living object that appeared above the parapet. The heavy cannons of the Ottomans were placed in battery, and the walls began to crumble beneath their salvos. Soliman was impatient of the delay which the resistance of so small a place as this citadel now caused him, and he summoned Czerny to surrender and sought to win him over the Ottoman service by offering to make him ruler of all Croatia. Czerny, whom his countrymen have not unworthily named the Leonidas of Hungary, was resolute to die in defense of his post, and he inspired all his men with his own spirit of unflinching courage. Three assaults were given by the Turks in August and September, all of which Cini repelled with great loss of the besiegers. The Turkish engineers now ran a mine under the principal bastion, and the attacking columns were kept back until the effect of the explosion could be ascertained. The mine was fired early in the morning of the 5th of September, and the bright streak of fire that shot up into the sky from the shattered bastion might have been thought to be that light of the great sultan who had died in his tent during the preceding night. A few hours before his death he had written in his Grand Vizier complaining that the drum of victory had not yet beat. He was not destined to witness Siget's fall, so his army continued the siege as if by his command, and all except his Grand Vizier, Sokali believed that he still lived and reigned. Sokali is said to have killed the Sultan's physicians lest the important secret should transpire, and to have issued orders in Suleiman's name, while the messengers and conveyed the despatches to Prince Selim, which summoned him to the throne. The fire of the Turkish batteries upon Sziget was continued for 4 days after the explosion of the great mine, until all the exterior defences of the citadel were destroyed, and of the inner works only a single tower was left standing. In that tower were Cini and 600 of his men; the rest of the garrison had perished. On the 8th of September the emissaries advanced in a dense column along a narrow bridge that led this last shelter of the defenders, and Cini, feeling that his hour were come, resolved to anticipate the charge. The gallant Magyar prepared himself for that as for a marriage feast. He wore his most splendid apparel, and a diamond of high price glittered in the clasp of his crest of the heron's plumes. He fastened to his girdle a purse containing the keys of the tower, and 100 ducats carefully chosen of Hungarian coinage. "The man who lays me out," he said, "shall not complain that he found nothing on me for his trouble. This case I keep while this arm can move. When it is stiff, let him who pleases take both case and ducats. but I have sworn never to be living fingerpost of Turkish square. Then from among four richly ornamented sables, which had been presented to him at some of the most brilliant epochs of his military career, he chose the oldest one. "With this good sword," he exclaimed, "gained I my first honours, and with this will I pass forth to hear my doom before the judgment seat of God." He then, with the banner of the empire borne before him by his standard bearer, went down into the court of the tower, where his 600 were drawn up in readiness to die with him. He addressed them in a few words of encouragement, which he ended by thrice invoking the name of Jesus. The Turks were now close to the tower gate. Cini bade caused a large mortar to be brought down and placed in the doorway and trained it point blank against the entrance. He had loaded this with broken iron and musket balls. At the instant when the foremost Janissaries raised his axe to break in the door, it was thrown open. Sweeney fired the mortar. The deadly shower poured through the mass of the assailants, destroying hundreds of them in an instant, and amid the smoke, the din, and the terror of this unexpected carnage, Sweeney sprang forth, sword in hand against the Turks, followed by his devoted troop. There was not one of those 600 Magyar sables but drank its fill on that day of self-immolation, before the gallant men who wielded them were overpowered. Cini met the death he sought from 2 musket balls through the body and an arrow wounded in the head. The Ottomans shrieked and raised the shout of Allah when they saw him fall, and they then poured into the citadel, which they fired and began to plunder. But Cini, even after death, smote his foes. He had caused all his remaining stores of powder to be placed beneath the tower, and according to some accounts, a slow match was applied to it by his orders immediately before the Magyars made their sally. Either from this or from the flames which the Turks had themselves kindled, the magazine exploded while the tower was filled with Ottoman soldiery, and together with the last battlements of Szeged, 3,000 of its destroyers were destroyed. Suleiman the Conqueror lay stark in his tent before the reeking and smouldering ruins. The drum of victory beat unheeded by him who had longed for its sound. He was insensible to all the roar of the assault and to the deadly earth-shock of the fired magazine of Szeged, nor could the tidings which now reached the camp of the surrender of the city of Gyula to Pertau Pasha soothe the dull, cold ear of death. The secret of the destinies of the Sultan was long well guarded. For more than 7 weeks the great Turkish army of 150,000 soldiers went, and came and fought and took towns and cities in the name of the dead man. The vizier Sokoli had caused the body of the partly embalmed before the royal tent was removed from before Shigat, and when the camp was struck, the corpse was placed in the covered litter in which Soliman had travelled during the campaign, and which was now borne along among the troops. Surrounded by the customary guards, and with all the ceremonies and homage which had been shown to the living monarch, Sokoli and the other high officers who knew the truth after the siege and capture of Baboksa and some other operations which employed the attention of the troops, gradually drove them towards the Turkish frontier. Suleiman's signature was adroitly counterfeited, written orders were issued in his name, and the report was sedulously spread among the soldiers that a severe attack of gout prevented the Sultan from appearing in public. At last Sokoli received intelligence that Prince Selim had been enthroned in Constantinople, and he then took measures for revealing to the soldiery the deed of the great Padishah. The army was now 24th of October 1566, 4 marches distant from Belgrade, and had halted for the night in the outskirts of a forest. Sokoli sent for the readers of the Koran who accompanied the troops and ordered them to assemble round the Sultan's litter in the night and at the fourth hour before daybreak. The hour at which Soliman had expired 48 days before to read the appointed service for the dead from the Koran, and call upon the name of God. At the chosen time, amid the stillness of the night, the army was roused from sleep by the loud, clear voices of muezzins that rose in solemn chant from around the royal tent, and where it echoed back from the sepulchral gloom of the forest. Those who stood on the right of the corpse called aloud, "All dominion perishes, and the last hour awaits all mankind." Those of the left answered, "The ever-living God alone is untouched by time of death." The soldiers who heard the well-known announcement of death gathered together in tumultuous groups with wild cries and lamentations.